Hey, before we get into it, this video was originally meant to be a short 15-minute summary of Murder on the Warp Express, and as you can see by the runtime, turned into much more than that. Just know that we're addressing everything about Don Quixote, including the teaser and trailer for Kanto 7 that recently came out. But a lot before that is gonna sound like you were meant to see this months ago, and I'm sure you can imagine why. Enjoy! Murder on the Warp Express is going down in history as the event that changed how we look at Don Quixote forever. Even 10 years down the line when we're fighting Diaz, the Red Mist, and Hopkins in the outskirts, I'm still gonna remember where I was on August 8th, 2024. Because no matter what comes next in Limbus's story, it is impossible to forget the 600 people in chat screaming about Don's feet. But hey, I get it. Back before Limbus, nearly every character in Project Moon was a stiff. And why wouldn't they be? Everyone from the chefs to the lawyers is expected to know how to tear up a human body for a paycheck. Sure, you'd get some people like Roland, Oswald, or Argalia who can crack a joke or lighten the mood, but guys like that are either masking their sorrows, clinically insane, or both. And then on May 27th, 2022, Project Moon released the Don Quixote character promo, introducing the community to something entirely new. For the first time, someone in the city was happy. There wasn't a lot to go off of, but everything that was here was a stark difference from the troubled or reserved characters we'd seen up until now. Dawn was energetic, she had a passion for fixers and a manner of speaking that sounded like she belonged in a totally different series. Hell, the entire concept of Don Quixote's character felt like she was another franchise's hero thrust into the cruel world of the city and forced to live by its rules. From the get-go, her existence among the main cast was fascinating in itself. And now that we're 18 months into Limbus Company and 2 months away from her Kanto, Murder on the Warp Express has given us the first crumbs to explain not only why she is this way, but how a person like her can manage to survive in the city. And if we're gonna spend another 60-odd days theory crafting what the hell she's about, the least I can do is give y'all a starting point. So today, we're going to unpack all of Dawn's lore, from her story progression to her IDs, her lineage, and even my personal theory for what could happen in Kanto 7. So goons and loons, welcome to the state of Don Quixote. And as always, let's start with the facts. Don Quixote is someone who describes herself as a righteous fixer set on protecting the weak. Not only that, but she speaks with this Middle English turn of phrase that isn't matched by anyone we've seen in the franchise so far. And while her turn of phrase can set her apart to some extent, it's hard to ignore that this idea of being a righteous fixer takes up the lion's share of her personality. Throughout the events of Limbus Company's first 3 Kantos, Dawn shows an admiration for any fixer she comes across, seeing anyone with that title as someone also in service to justice and an inherent good. Seriously, Chiquita's enough of a fixer fangirl to wear at least a dozen pins on her outfit and ask for an autograph from a grade 1 fixer while he is killing her and the rest of her co-workers. However, that doesn't mean she sees fixers as infallible. Rather, she sees them as someone upholding a high standard of duty and defaults to that on her first impression. That grade 1 fixer I mentioned earlier may have broken her bones, but only did so after Dawn picked a fight with the Nest's security. So even then, he could reasonably justify his actions, because what's just as important to Dawn is that sense of righteousness and justice. And during these same 3 Kantos, there are 3 incidents where Don Quixote causes trouble for her fellow sinners. 2 of them are directly from her acting to right some sort of wrong she's witnessing. The first happens when a pawn shop owner is being shaken down by some syndicate thugs, where she knocked said goon out, causing the sinners to fight the entire Ting Tang gang. Luckily for them, the syndicate didn't put up much of a fight, and even lost the clothes off their backs in the process. But the second and latest one didn't go so well. Once again, this is what led to a fight with the grade 1 fixer.
Goodness!
The sinners are going through immigration to get to a new nest, and Don Quixote witnesses a father and child being separated, leading to her to take matters into her own hands and catching several dozen in turn. And if this is starting to sound like Don's some hyperactive kid that doesn't know how to stop herself from causing a scene, then you're totally right. Beyond having this haphazard sense of justice, Don Quixote has a lot of traits we'd associate with someone who's immature. She excitedly asks for mermaid ice cream after just learning about it, convinces her team to make a pit stop to get onto a party boat, and when tasked with writing a report about sapient raw chickens that attack people's heads, make sure to mention that she's taken bites out of them. Now, don't get it twisted. This character is a grown woman with a job that she is more than capable of handling, but all of this points to a certain level of dissonance about Dawn. Because as a sinner, while she can't die, this does beg the question of how she can continue living while acting so erratically, something that her guide, Virgilius, is more than prepared to answer. By Canto 3, Virgilius has had more than enough of Don Quixote's brand of heroism. And when Virgilius has had enough of something, let's just say he's good at putting his foot down.
I asked for an excuse, not a justification of your views. That's 3 separate times you've jeopardized our work with your deranged behavior. What do you think? Speak.
While my own actions did inconvenience my colleagues.
You're sorely mistaken if you believe the company is sincerely curious about your input.
If the company insists so, then
I'm sick of this. I'm sure you remember what went down when you joined. I hope you haven't forgotten the deal we struck that day, Miss Don Quixote.
Now, I don't know about you, but if I'm coming off of getting murfed by the TSA only for my boss, who has a premium license to kill, to put me under his leather hydraulic press and say that I'm a flight risk, I'd have to take some time to think about my life choices. And for Dawn, that is the moment the reality finally broke through her fantasy and she learned, to put it lightly, to sit down. And it seems to have taken, because for the rest of the Canto, she doesn't cause any trouble. She may have beaten up the only other blonde on the bus as his house was burning down, but in her defense, he was going on his own rampage, and she just kinda knew what to do in those situations. From here on out though, Don Quixote shows much more restraint, and it's not at the cost of her being herself either. While she does act carefully around Virgilius through the end of Canto 3, she still has that same spark in her eyes in any situation that doesn't challenge that sense of justice. And by the time the team goes to T-Corp, she's even rewarded for her efforts to save an injured member of the Blade lineage from the Kurokumo clan. It's just unfortunate that she'll never get credit for that heroism, as this person's name has long been lost to time. But even during Canto 6, when she sees registered fixers of the OOFI Association performing what appears to be some heinous experiment on kidnapped people, she's come far enough to at least try asking if her assumptions are correct, which it turns out they mostly are. The only thing she got wrong was that these guys were only pretending to be members of the OOFI Association and were actually members of the Ring. So violence was inevitable, but she thought to ask first, and that's what's important. So by now, we've established that Don Quixote is someone with a strong sense of justice that greatly admires fixers and has an excitable personality. But she's also learned to think about the consequences of her actions enough to avoid causing problems. And while we could stop there and move on to the events of Murder on the Warp Express, there's another side to Don Quixote we need to acknowledge. Or rather, 8 sides. Identities, the latest and greatest advancements in questioning your life choices. Each one of these connects to a Don Quixote from a mirror dimension where she lives a significantly different life. And while some of them only amount to seeing Dawn in different situations, there's a pattern between most of the Dawn identities that changes how we look at the main traits of our Dawn. For instance, every one of these IDs has a sense of justice they follow, but when looking at IDs like the Middle Little Sister and N-Corp Mittelhammer, who are portrayed as menaces and threats to anyone they come across in Limbus, Dawn feels less like a bringer of justice and more like a promise of wrath for whoever she aligns with. It implies that the morality she has can be twisted if it's encouraged by a collective. It's also worth mentioning that there isn't any coercion she's under to follow these groups in either of these IDs. She's just started working for the Middle in that MD, and while N-Corp isn't above to use brainwashing to make more Inquisitors, her cutscene makes a point to say that she's never had a need for it, suggesting that every Don Quixote finds themselves aligned with some greater cause to believe in. Or, in the case of Lobotomy Ego Lantern, bonding with a flesh carpet that eats people. But this doesn't mean she's destined to go along with the crowd either. Her other, more reserved IDs, like the She Association Director, the Sank Association Director, and the T-Corp Class 3 Collection Staff, are much more thoughtful versions of Dawn, likely because she's in a leadership position. And each of these three finds some way to consolidate her sense of justice in their line of work, though some are more successful than others. While it's got competition with W Corp Dawn, the She Association Director Don Quixote is the ID that's been dealt the roughest hand. We don't get a lot from the cutscene other than a mention that this Dawn remains expressionless whenever she has to take on an assassination job, the act causing her to feel torn with remorse after the fact. But with the She being an association that treats all life as equal to let live and let die, and her being the section director, she never shows that to her coworkers, always keeping up a jovial smile. And in being unable to uphold that sense of justice, she instead takes solace in protecting her section from what harm would come to them. In She Ishmael's own cutscene, she even says how much it rendeth my guts to goad them with such empty words, when her superior continues to pile more work onto her team. Because, in the absence of being able to keep to her own code, she'll latch on to those who she aligns with like a found family. But on a lighter note, the Sank Association ID might be the happiest out there. While still a director for a fixer office, the fact that the Sank Association deals with being proxies for duels fits well into her sense of being a righteous fixer and a knight for the needy. It's almost perfect for Dawn, since even after the person interviewing her implies that she must be deluded, she claps back saying that she knows being a hero on its own is nearly impossible. But if she can do so under the guise of business, that's a compromise she's more than happy to make. Then we've got the most complex example being the T-Corp Collector. While this ID isn't a director, she is in a management position at T-Corp, leading her team to take down time tax dodgers. But what's interesting is that when we see Dawn going about her job with a regular fervor, the narrator, hi Carmen, mentions that she isn't like this for every case. With District 20 itself being a horrendously unfair place for the lower class, Dawn isn't blindly following or giving orders on handling all the tax evaders. She's only that gung-ho about it when the person in her sights is one of the wealthy that have no need to evade taxes, and is much more hesitant when she has to make a call to a poorer house. And since this is one of the former cases, the cutscene shows Dawn going ham on the bozo, with a similar level of enthusiasm as her more extreme counterparts. Now that all doubt has left her mind and she's confident that the criminal deserves this punishment, she leaves this man with such little time that he may not even reach the front door until sundown and moves on with her day. All of this together changes what I like to call the constants of Don Quixote. Every Dawn has a strong sense of right and wrong they follow, and in all cases, it either prioritizes her want to protect the weak from the strong, or to serve whatever family she's bonded with. The word family here is very intentional too, since the main four examples are either her in groups with extreme loyalty as a virtue, or in the She's case, the only thing she can cherish. Then, instead of her interest in fixers, the constant of Dawn across all of the MDs is her ability to become fixated on something. LCB Dawn, N-Corp Mittelhammer, W Corp L3 Cleanup Agent, the Middle Little Sister, and Lobotomy Ego Lantern Dawn all share this trait on some topic. Now, even if the other IDs don't have this same level of hyperfixation, it's usually because that Dawn has something else more important to spend her time on, or in the case of the Sank Director, is just living her best life. So with that, we now have both the constants of our Limbus Company's sinner Don Quixote, and the constants of every Don Quixote across the mirror dimensions. Or at least, we'll see how well this ages in a year. But with all of the main traits of Dawn in mind, let's now explore the events of Murder on the Warp Express. In this intervallo, the sinners are brought onto a warp train both for the purpose of traveling to their next destination, District 16, but also to take on a job requested by W Corp to investigate and handle the disappearances of people on the train. Because while the warp train itself puts people in a state some would call hundreds of times worse than death, check out this video if you want to know more, it shouldn't be possible for anyone to die or leave the train while it's in transit. And the sinners, being given first-class tickets to avoid the lesser-known consequences of taking the warp train, quickly find out that whatever is responsible for these disappearances is a blood fiend, a creature that embodies the desire for blood to such a degree that it's able to twist its physical properties, bypassing the train's ability to sustain life while in use. During the investigation, the sinners come across a fixer named Sasha from the multi-crack office, and while she's clearly someone who has a little interest in helping people out of the goodness of her heart, she is making an effort to defend the passengers in her car from a horde of blood bags, these people that were turned into blood-obsessed minions by the blood fiend. Plus, there's this cute little moment where one of the kids on the train talks with Dawn about how cool fixers are and how she wants to be one when she grows up. Dawn, who hasn't heard of Sasha's cynical interests, makes a point to praise her for her chivalry and is emboldened all the more as the sinners make their way down the train cars to the back, where finally, after fighting through a growing mass of blood bag victims, they reach the blood fiend himself, a man named Cassetti. And Cassetti is, in polite terms, ambitious. He speaks in this grandiose prose and calls himself a prince with the intent to make this train his kingdom, and he has no intention of allowing the sinners to remove him. In fact, the crew quickly realizes that he hasn't left this car in a while, and if that's the case, then the only way that he could have impacted everyone on the train without leaving is if he had help. It is at this point, Sasha enters the room, surprised that the sinners have made it here, and just as quickly, she starts to mourn about how she put up the best fight she could, being the last of her office alive, yet down to a single arm. With only a desperate instinct to survive, she pleaded with Cassetti to spare her, and was made into his kindred, a blood fiend in permanent service to him. Soon, blood bags follow after Sasha, and with the sinners having fought everyone in the cars beyond the one she was protecting, they all realize that these blood bags are everyone from her car, everyone, including that child. Seething with anger, Dawn confronts Sasha about what she's done, but Sasha dismisses her, arguing that it's a relief that the kid won't ever grow up to be a fixer. Having worked at an office that relies heavily on prosthetics, Sasha grew numb to any sensations a person would typically have in her line of work, like a fear of pain or dismemberment, and felt an increasing sense of drudgery, her concluding that the only thing that dreaming to be a fixer gets you is either crushing disappointment or an early grave. And needless to say, this does not sit well with Dawn. Thoroughly enraged, she draws her lance and charges at Sasha, and what follows is a grueling fight between the sinners and the blood fiends that ultimately ends in a draw. Because the mechanisms on the warp train won't allow anyone to die, and the regenerative abilities of the blood fiends compounded on top means that even if they can't overpower the sinners, they also can't be truly hurt by them. And yet, knowing this, and bloodied and beaten in her own right, Dawn refuses to stop attacking Cassetti. But when Sasha swipes the sinner's keycard, their means of enduring the train ride, the room draws to an immediate stalemate. Dante and Faust take it upon themselves to negotiate with Cassetti, ensuring that he won't be under any harm. Don Quixote pleads with Dante to not compromise with a man that would ruin so many lives so callously, but with no other options, they press on, leaving Dawn in a state of utter dejection. Dante and Faust move to the freight car of the train and start the negotiations, quickly finding that if they want the keycard back, they will have to entirely give up their mission. And while they're both hesitant to accept that offer, they realize that the alternative is thousands of years locked in what is effectively a prison. So left without any other options, Dante accepts the offer.
Objection!
Don Quixote, still in immense pain from the fight, pushes her way into Mephistopheles, resolves that at any cost, she will not let a monster like Cassetti live. Yet unlike with the Ting Tang Gang or K-Corp, she's fully aware of the consequences. Fully aware that at any moment, Cassetti could condemn them to the hellish eternity that is the warp train. And yet, she still accepts the burden for both herself and all of the sinners if it means that Quixote, this man that corrupts fixers and consigns the innocent to do his bidding, will also suffer for that eternity like the wretch he is. Dante and Faust hold her back and try their best to calm her down, but fail to notice Quixote was approaching until it's too late. Quixote says a prayer to his family and leaps at Don Quixote, piercing her neck to turn her into his second kindred. And unfortunately for him, it works. Don Quixote rises into the air, and for the first time in all of Limbus Company, her running shoes fall off. Throughout this intervalo, Dawn and the other sinners have brought up how she never takes off her shoes, even after walking through the belly of the pallid whale several months ago, or when she's sleeping. She's adamant enough about it that even Virgilius is willing to allow Dawn to keep her shoes on, despite W Corp's regular procedures for first-class passengers. And as the scene plays out before them, Dante recalls just how much she cares for Rocinante.
Running shoes? Ah, dost thou speak of our dear Rocinante? I have battled through thick and thin, feast and famine with dear Rocinante. It hath been a loyal steed by my side for however long it hath been in existence. Verily, Rocinante and I remain bound together even in slumber. There shall be no separating the two of us. 'Tis a very odd insinuation thou makest. Rocinante, 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 Rocinante? Rocinante!
An explosion of pressure erupts from Dawn, killing Faust as she shields Dante from the blast. All that's left to the manager is total darkness. Don Quixote, now standing over Quixote, emanates a crimson aura with red, piercing eyes. Quixote, realizing his mistake, pleads for his life, repeating the same phrase, "I beg for the mercy of the second kindred. I beg for the mercy of the second kindred," before his better. But all he's given is a look of disdain as he faces the judgment of Don Quixote.
Coagulate, then melt away.
In an instant, Quixote is reduced to nothing more than a stain under the bus seats, leaving only Dante and Don Quixote.
Indeed, you must be the promised timepiece. Rocinante, to me, I beseech you.
At her request, Dante then slips the Rocinante back onto Don, and with little other fanfare, the sinners arrive in District 16, and only Dante, Faust, and Virgilius know the truth. Don Quixote is, and always has been, a blood fiend. Now, while there are other noteworthy arcs that go on in this intervalo, especially with Faust's own struggles, the reveal of Don being a blood fiend has lit a fire under Don fans and loreheads over the past few days. And some people who theorized about this side of Don Quixote for longer than a year are celebrating, while I've seen some others that were taken off guard worry that this could be Limbus Company jumping the shark. Personally, I wasn't a blood fiend believer, but I am happy that Limbus's narrative was intentional enough to let people have the means to track it as early as the game's release date. And while I can understand the worries that some people have about this being overpowered or some kind of asspull, after researching this video, I feel there's enough evidence to not only calm those worries, but that Kanto 7 not only has the potential to meet the hype, but exceed it. But to explain that, we first need to talk about blood fiends. Now, I should give y'all a quick disclaimer. Everything we're talking about in this section is crumbs of info based on what little has been revealed about blood fiends in Project Moon, as well as the culture of vampires from the Vampire the Masquerade tabletop game. And look, I get how odd it sounds that a tabletop game of all things is being included as a source material for Limbus Company, but as time went on, the terminology and culture of the vampires from Vampire the Masquerade continued to line up with how blood fiends were presented in Project Moon, to the extent that using its logic makes the most sense to fill in the all but confirmed gaps that Project Moon has. That being said, there's still no way to get total certainty on what Don's deal is, or how blood fiends play into the story until the release of Kanto 7. I mean, it'd be pretty odd if we could, am I right? So once again, consider this the starting line for the mystery we'll solve come October. And the first question we need to answer is, what is a blood fiend? Well, in 5 words, it's a distortion. But different. See, in the world of Project Moon, distortions have only become a well-known phenomenon after an event called the White Nights and Dark Days. However, both distortions and blood fiends have existed long before then, albeit they were much rarer. While we don't know who the first blood fiend is, the creation of all the blood fiends after the first, with some exception, is by the same process we saw with Cassetti and Sasha in Moe. A blood fiend will choose a victim to bite onto and infuse them with their blood, turning them into their own kindred. And the name kindred is quite intentional, as not only does it show an affiliation between blood fiends, but a level of hierarchy as well. This level of hierarchy is decided by how close the individual blood fiend is to the original blood fiend. So since Cassetti was of the 6th kindred, or 6 degrees away, him turning Sasha would make her the 7th. And by this logic, we can clearly see how Don, being the 2nd kindred, saw Cassetti as little more than an insect in the family. Speaking of, this family culture is the theme that comes into play outside of Limbus Company too. In the side story Distortion Detective, the final released chapter has the main character Moses come face to face with a blood fiend named Lerriere. While we don't get any information about what kindred she is, she carries herself as someone with a higher status and reveals quite a bit about blood fiend culture. Blood fiends, by their nature, have an endless urge to covet blood. The greatest analogy to it is how people in the city covet money. It's a means for survival, status, satisfaction, but unlike money, it's also something intrinsically valuable to them. Like, if you ever lost a night to playing Cookie Clicker because you enjoyed seeing number go up by bleeding your army of grandmothers dry, then you felt what it's like to be a happy blood fiend. It's this quality that connects them to being a distortion, a being whose existence is based around a single desire. But being a sanguine desire enjoyer comes with its fair share of drawbacks. One of the largest being that you're always jonesing for a neck. And much like with flesh bodies, the head doesn't take kindly to that. So once there were enough blood fiends to cause a scene, some of the elders, like Lerriere, agreed to a system where they would spread out to every nest and hide their activity until their numbers dwindled. That meant every nest would have an elder to keep watch over them, laying low and putting some of their members to rest for the foreseeable future. Funnily enough, this same practice appears in Vampire the Masquerade, where vampire society at large has made an effort to convince the world that they don't exist. And true to its name, this massive effort is called the Masquerade. Elders are also a noteworthy role in the tabletop game with a certain level of status, as age typically translates to it. But neither there nor in PM does it explicitly state a connection to the kindred hierarchy. But in modern days, it may not even matter. Remember how blood fiends were distortions made before the distortion phenomenon? Well, it's also possible for someone to distort into a blood fiend after the phenomenon. In fact, it's much more common, and this has put the blood fiend culture at risk, because up until now, there was an understanding between most blood fiends, to follow this design of secrecy. But with these new blood fiends that are distorting outside of the family, they're making their own rules and forming their own colonies. But with these new blood fiends that are distorting outside of the family, they're making their own rules, forming their own colonies. Lerriere even requests Moses to eliminate one such blood fiend named Rusk before he's able to dethrone her as an elder. As of now, what Moses chooses to do with that request hasn't been revealed, so we won't get a first-hand explanation from someone of the new culture, but we still have a certain outlier that I'd be remiss to not mention. That being a woman named Elena. In Library of Ruina, one of the final encounters of the game is with a notorious blood fiend that has gone against the culture by making a show of reaping people to covet their blood, quickly becoming a star of the city in the process. By the time Roland, Angelica, and the Charles office would track her down, she had already made her own boudoir composed from the blood of 4,172 people, any victims of hers along the way being reduced to blood bags. And while she would escape the Charles office and later come back to the library to encounter Roland again, this time she takes a moment to talk about her reasoning for going against the family. As of now, the earliest record of the first Blood Fiend making the first kindred comes from a currently unnamed mansion, where a multitude of people were forcibly stripped of their humanity. In her key page, Elena says that this is how she too was turned. And early on, she felt a sense of guilt at having to drink blood to sate her thirst, wondering what this made her. Was she a victim of circumstance now forced to harm others? Or a monster in her own right? However, those concerns would wane over time as she realized that no matter what, her ability to live is now dependent on her taking blood from others. And despite still appearing mostly human, her doing what she must to survive now makes her a target by the world at large. This, of course, is a sentiment held by many Blood Fiends, how humanity is their enemy that cannot respect their needs, forcing them to get creative in covertly satiating themselves. But Elena came to a different conclusion. If she was reborn to suffer this way against her own will, why should she have to hide herself? Instead, she would create blood bags as she fed, letting them wreak havoc across the nests. As time went on, she would be targeted by several offices and associations and take pride in her ascendance to becoming a star of the city. And once Charles' office finally proved to be too much for her, she joined the Blue Reverberations Ensemble to take the power of the library so she could live freely, ultimately leading to her demise. Beyond that, there's also an abnormality based around Blood Fiends called Nosferatu. Its existence is made to represent that mansion that created the first kindred, and one of its abilities confirms a weakness that all Blood Fiends share, aptly named Fear of Water. However, since it's an abnormality, and would have only come to form at earliest 10 years before the White Nights and Dark Days, there's no evidence to suggest this is the first Blood Fiend. And that's all we've got on Blood Fiends right now. And after digging into this, I gotta hand it to the Don Blood Fiend believers for holding out so long since launch. Because despite being called mad for such an obscure get, there were plenty of reasons for them to hold tight to this idea. First, there's a scene in Kanto 2 where Dawn volunteers to dance for the mariachis to get permission to pass, but her movements are called insincere and done without a clear and pure heart. While this doesn't necessarily point to her being a blood fiend, her response shows that there is something even she doesn't know that's irregular. Then there's her base ego, La Sangre de Sancho, which both inflicts bleed on the target and heals Dawn by half of the damage dealt. In gameplay terms, this mirrors not only the concept of a blood fiend, but the mechanics that the enemies in Moe use to heal themselves. And then we get the strongest piece of evidence when confronting Cassetti. PM really made a point to ensure that both Dawn and Cassetti had several lines within this scene, effectively showcasing how similar their speech patterns could be. And there are other smaller signs out there, but I think most of y'all get the idea by now. And besides, I'm sure there's a much more pressing question on your mind. What does all of this mean for Don Quixote now and in Kanto 7? Well, to answer that question, we have to discuss something else first. It is now time to leave the realm of Project Moon and talk about the source of Don Quixote. The Don Quixote of Limbus Company is based on two different works, those being Don Quixote, the novel written by Miguel de Cervantes in 1605, and Man of La Mancha, a 1965 musical inspired by the book created by Dale Wasserman, Mitch Leigh, and Joe Darian. And the reason I haven't felt a need to mention them until now is because they could effectively mean everything and also nothing. If you'll indulge me for a moment, there's this Buddhist phrase that addresses the path one must take to gain enlightenment. Mountains are mountains, water is water. This phrase meaning that to the literal mind, there is a clear distinction between what is a mountain and what is water. And in a similar way, Don Quixote of Limbus Company is distinct from the Don Quixote in the source material. We can and have identified what makes up her qualities as a character by sticking with the evidence from Limbus Company. But if we instead look at this with a novice's perspective of Buddhism, or in this case, treat the source material as canon, then it's clear that no matter what's come of this book or that video game, they're all from the same source. These same ideas of delusional heroism, a sense of justice, and the cruel reality that awaits Don Quixote are one and the same. Don Quixote in Limbus even shares the title Sueño Imposible, or the impossible dream on her lance, pants, much like the name of the iconic song from Man of La Mancha. So in that regard, we could see everything from the source material as relevant. Don Quixote being both a pest in the original novel and an inspiring knight in the musical. That rat bastard Fernando, desperate to marry a woman that would rather die before being with him. Dulcinea, both not existing at all as a character Don Quixote interacts with in the novel, but also in the musical, being a woman named Aldonza that is tired of being around men and sees being born as the greatest crime she could have committed, which, Jesus, really sounds like someone that would agree with Elena on some key topics. And don't even get me started on the Knight of Mirrors, a man who confronts Don Quixote during his quest and forces him to face the mirror of reality, shattering the idea of him being any sort of hero and only a fool, which has at least 3 different major connotations in Limbus Company. And you know what? If we look closer into Cervantes' work, he references a certain little-known poem called Orlando Furioso, and we haven't even touched on Sancho, or the Barber, or Don Quixote tilting at windmills because exploring Project Moon lore is like diving into a yawning abyss where if you go deep enough, you are drowning in a mountain of your own design, because mountains are no longer mountains, and water is no longer water. And now, I kinda wanna forgive Project Moon for not using distorted Heathcliff as well as I would have liked in Kanto 6. And yet, if we persist onward with the thoughts of Buddhism to the state called enlightenment, this is no longer the case. Both the source material of Don Quixote and the Limbus character herself may come from the same ideas, but it's not especially relevant to try and make every single detail about that source material matter. In other words, if I tried to pull every sentence or character from either of these works and make them into something to theorycraft, we'd be here all day, and most of it won't even be useful to you anyway. So even if they are of the same source, mountains are mountains, and water is water. Limbus and the source material can coexist without having to be brought up at the same time. So, with this philosophy in mind, I will now show you all of the honorable mentions of theories I am aware of before going into my own theory on what we can expect for Kanto 7. As always, if I missed your theory, then that clearly means I hate you. If I missed your theory, then that means it either is going to be addressed now, or you can talk about it in the comments. And hey, maybe subscribe while you're there, because I know this is the longest essay that's gone up on this channel. And who knows, maybe with more number, I can do more of this stuff for you. And now, as promised, what can we expect from Don Quixote? Well, first, we need to understand the current state she's in, and the end of Moe gives us a lot to work with. Because while the impeccable reveal of Don's lineage is one of the most hype moments of Limbus, what's more useful to understanding her right now is her victim, Cassetti, and more specifically, his dialogue. When we meet Cassetti in Murder on the Warp Express, he isn't treated like some major threat, but more as some rambling madman that can't be killed. He calls himself a prince and addresses people by whatever position they hold in his eyes, either as a peasant or a fellow monarch. And even if he is living in a warp train, we know this attitude of his isn't caused by him being stuck in time here, because in his observation logs, Faust mentions that his instability is inflicted by the familia the subject has fled from. She also mentions that Cassetti keeps coming back to 3 certain words during their encounter: the parade, the mask, and the prince. And it's through these 3 ideas we can start understanding Cassetti's, and therefore Don's, current state. Starting with the prince, Cassetti acts with not only a commitment, but a desperation to fulfill this role. Several of his lines include him talking like he's affirming to not only himself, but to the world that he is indeed a prince. And it almost sounds like he receives some sort of punishment should he not maintain that role. Of course it's excellent, because this mask was created by none other than the great, the eminent, the barber himself, whose name I dare not even speak. But it It's so much. Nope. Nope. I'm smiling. Look how hard I'm smiling and laughing. Yes, I am the prince. That's what I am. This implies that Cassetti isn't just some insane old man, though yeah, he is that too, but someone who's been coerced to maintain this attitude. And that brings us to the mask, which is something Cassetti seems to both appreciate and wish to remove. Oh, this mask! Won't come off. Can't take it off. Shouldn't take it off. There's no prince without the mask. We're so ugly behind the mask. So we all decided to hide how repulsive we've become. But once I've drunk your blood full, then it'll all go back to how it used to be. Only then can I unmask myself. For whatever reason, Cassetti sees himself as repulsive and needs to wear a mask until he drinks his fill to have everything go back to however it used to be. Alongside that, his statements that he can't and shouldn't take it off, as well as there being no prince without the mask, imply that it's some kind of necessary burden that he has to wear. And of course, there would be no mask without its creator, the barber. And if we put all of this together, the most reasonable explanation is that in an effort for Cassetti to hide from his familia, he received help from this barber to create a mask that would allow him to escape. But as a side effect, it causes him to have to take on a role as if he's in some stage play. This idea is supported by Cervantes' Don Quixote as well, as there is a barber in the novel, and Don Quixote himself collects the legendary Mambrino's helmet, which turns out to be a barber's basin. The trend here being that whoever this barber is, they specialize in providing accessories that involve the wearer creating a new reality. But then, why would Cassetti agree to force himself into this state where he has to lie low and play as a prince? Well, that is where the parade comes in. Cassetti talks exactly twice about starting some kind of parade. The first is right before he fights the sinners and speaks of a parade where a prince becomes a king, and the second is within Mephistopheles where he says he had not intended to start this parade early. Now, considering that Cassetti's goal in Moe was to continue to live in the warp train and feed himself while creating more blood fiends, it feels reasonable that the parade he's talking about is this rise to power, his slow build of a new kingdom from within the confines of the train. And while this is true, the word choice here seems peculiar. Because what is the opposite of a masquerade? An event where people live in secrecy, then a parade where the population is out in full force. In other words, Cassetti left the family in order to carve out a following for himself and start the parade, where he could make a kingdom of blood fiends and new kindred under his will, much like the new generation created out of the distortion phenomenon. And you can see how well that went, but if we compare Cassetti's and Don's experiences, there's a significant amount of crossover here. Cassetti sees himself as a prince, while Don sees herself as a righteous fixer. They're both separated from the familia in some way, and they both have their own apparel that supports their escape and their delusions. But Don Quixote's history and intentions is where they start to differ. If we go in chronological order, we know that Don was born of the second kindred and has likely been alive for hundreds of years. Considering the number Cassetti threw out, and the fact that Cervantes' Don Quixote came out in 1605, let's say she's about 400 years old? Yeah, that feels thematic. Then, at some point in her long life, she felt the need to escape the Blood Fiend family and was inflicted with a similar madness that Cassetti was. This time either through a Rocinante or a prototype of it. And this is what led to her taking on this persona. As time passed, the persona not only became easier for Don to follow, but became ingrained in her enough that she forgot entirely about her time as a blood fiend. Alternatively, we could say that Rocinante, since it's already unlike the mask in that it can be taken off, could also be different in that it suppresses memories too, perhaps with J-Corp's technology. But I think her succumbing to the influence over time makes for a better story. Then there's the large gap of time where Dawn lived before coming into contact with Limbus Company. But at some point either during this time or before she escaped the family, Dawn would create her own kindred. These could be characters from the original work like Sancho or Dulcinea, or separate kindred entirely. Whoever they are, these kindred and Don would eventually come into conflict with Limbus Company, as Faust was able to compare Cassetti's weapons to the redacted kindred in his logs. However the fight turned out, Limbus Company struck some kind of deal with Don Quixote that was compelling enough for her to join the LCB and work with her promised timepiece. There is also a segment in her life where she was studied, apparently under her own will? I'm not sure where in the timeline this is, but it's at some point after her escape. And while I don't think we have a clear answer as to who was running this, I like the idea of it being Limbus Company itself. The fact that Moses works for the LCD and that she interacted with Rusk, who is a blood fiend that doesn't know he's a blood fiend, implies that Limbus has had experience with repressed blood fiend memories before and would be inclined to use that during this agreement. But even if we assume that this is with someone else like N Corp or P Corp, Dawn being willing to put Rocinante back on in Moe suggests that she's willing to participate in these too. But that still leaves one question up in the air. Why would she agree to this in the first place? What is Don Quixote's goal in joining Limbus Company? And the answer is right in front of us. There are two posters in this ego art that translate into something meaningful about Don Quixote. The first is this bottom poster, which, when translated to English, states, "The goal is to solve the righteous character problem," meaning that wherever she is, Dawn has agreed to something that would remove her righteous fixer personality. And since we know she's willing to still wear Rocinante, that means she wants to remove that personality without removing Rocinante. What she wants is to live in this safety without the burden of performing this role. In fact, I believe what Dawn wants is to keep her memory as a blood fiend while no longer having this thirst, letting her live her life as a normal person. Her dream is to live without ignoring either aspect of herself, perhaps even finding a way to allow others, like her kindred, like Sancho, Dulcinea, or all of blood fiend kind, to live in the city without living under a rock or drowning in an endless thirst. And wouldn't that just match all of the constants of Dawn's sense of justice? Protecting the weak and persecuted, and supporting her family? And the reason I believe this is because if we translate the rainbow banner at the top of this ego art, we come upon the final truth of Don Quixote. Mountains are mountains, waters are waters. The proudly positioned phrase of these experiments is for the sake of two parts of oneself coexisting while being distinct. An impossible dream and an unreachable star, only made possible with the golden bow and the promised timepiece for a righteous fixer. And that, to me, is the state of Don Quixote. Before Canto 7. What, you thought it was just gonna stop with La Criatura? When the Hat Man is right here? Nah, goons, what's a hero without a struggle to overcome? And luckily for us, I think we have just enough info to make some predictions on what that struggle's gonna look like. So, first off, the man in Canto 7's promo art matches up with the silhouette shown in the Limbus Company trailer for Damian's crew. Not only that, but his outfit is similar to how vampire hunters are portrayed in media. Combining these two, there is a significant chance that this man both wields the sign and is also a blood fiend hunter. But we can go further than that, because this sign that we've seen throughout all of Limbus Company is based on the mark of Cain. And this is especially threatening for Don Quixote, because if we look back at Vampire the Masquerade, we can see that all vampires in it originate from Cain. And do you know what this means? Because I don't. I just included that part so that nobody in the comments would say I didn't catch it, because I don't think there's really any huge connection to make about it without it being a reach. But this guy's probably really powerful. Regardless, there is evidence that this man has powers that are in the same ballpark as Damian, and that he hunts blood fiends. And I can easily see that someone like this would not be fond of a solution that would allow them to come out of hiding and live among humans. I've also seen some theories that suggest that this guy is a part of an N-Corp sect that's like an offshoot, similar to the Inquisitors, but separate in that it specializes in hunting blood fiends. But while this is a fine idea, I think it still ignores one major detail. Returning to Murder on the Warp Express, Cassetti's mention of the parade feels too specific to be something that only he thought of. Something that's such a perfect contrast to the Masquerade is damn hard to ignore. And with what little we've seen of P-Corp being comprised of Gothic architecture, again, something that's common to vampire media, there's reason to believe District 16 is home to more blood fiends than the usual nest. So what if the parade is a concerted effort by the blood fiends in District 16 to come out of hiding in full force, and the Hat Man is here to cull it? And if that's true, this would put Limbus Company in between two major forces that wield immense power, both of which would have it out for Don Quixote. And what would be a greater conflict than a righteous fixer who is trying to do justice for both blood fiends and humanity, only to be targeted by both sides? And if you're saying, Frey, how the hell are you gonna claim that such a big plot point can even exist when you're referencing a tabletop game that only coincidentally has to do with Limbus Company? Well, my precious little straw man searching for wisdom, if you won't believe me, maybe you should listen to the Night of the Mirrors. So I can't play the audio for this part without being copyright claimed. So, you can either take my word that the dialogue here is paraphrased from this scene in the musical, or just check out the link I leave in the description for the full thing. In Man of La Mancha, there is a scene where Don Quixote tries to comfort Aldonza, the woman he calls Dulcinea. And while all the guy succeeds at is making himself look like a loon, he's soon stopped by the self-proclaimed Knight of the Mirrors. And immediately, the man tells Don Quixote that his adventure is a futile quest, and that he has no reason to continue before surrounding him in his mirrored shields, forcing Don Quixote to see himself for what he truly is, a deranged old man playing a hero. As I mentioned before, the mirrors that are involved here could make a full section in itself, but what I will leave you on is what the knight says to Don Quixote. Look, Don Quixote. Look in the mirror of reality. A madman, dressed for a masquerade. Drown, drown, Don Quixote. Thy masquerade has ended. We now have 3 pieces of connected media that specifically mention a masquerade, and all 3 of them mention a means in which it can end. And look, I only expect anywhere from 20 to 40% of this theory to be right, but no matter whether the Hat Man exterminates all the blood fiends, whether the parade marches through the streets of District 16, or Don Quixote reaches that unreachable star and finds this cure she's sought after, come October, this masquerade and her dream will come to an end. That is, before Orlando Furioso comes in with the steel chair! So, funny story. I released a trailer for this video on Twitter a while ago and said that it would come out on October 9th. And less than a day later, Project Moon released a teaser that fucked me harder than a vuvuzela in a soccer hentai. Sorry, football. And after a short panic attack, a brief stint of alcoholism, and the consequences, it only feels right to address both the teaser and the trailer for Season 5, Oblivion. Because while the Dawn Bloodfiend cure theory still holds water after the teaser, there are some changes we gotta talk about for the actual events of Kanto 7. Also, we're gonna talk about the teaser until the very end, because the trailer hasn't come out as of the time of writing. And I'll be damned if I'm not gonna have at least 5 days to write out this video before bleeding out in Kanto 7. But in short, the Oblivion trailer sheds light on 3 characters, who I'm gonna call the Hat Man, the Scissor Woman, and Moses. Because this has to be Moses from Distortion Detective. And here's the thing about making theories with PM lore. Anyone worth their salt is gonna search for everything in the games and side stories, maybe the source material if they're feeling spicy. But even if you know everything that has happened in the lore, any theory is a series of gambas where you often have 2 to 3 things that could happen and just gotta pick the most likely with the evidence, knowing that PM hates being predictable and will drift hard into a buck wild ending. The only reason I haven't talked about this before is because that sounds like some coward shit. It's a lot more fun to just bet on the most educated guess and live with the consequences. But fuck all that noise, this is Moses! Between her taking in a breath during her dialogue, her confident manner of speaking about blood fiends, and the color and font of the text matching up with official releases of Distortion Detective at Hom Hom Pong Pong, I will gladly take the biggest L if Moses isn't in this kanto. Plus, it goes pretty damn well with the blood fiend cure theory. Because if Moses interacted with Rusk, again, a blood fiend that isn't aware he himself is a blood fiend, we'd want to have an expert on distortions to manage Don Quixote from the time she joined Limbus Company and had her interaction with Faust and Virgilius. And I'm not saying that Don met all three of them at the same time or that we know what order it happened in, but Moses and the LCD had to be a part of it. While we're on the topic, I know there's a theme of these base ego arts being depictions of the sinner's own rooms on Mephistopheles, but considering that Don's has specific text in this art that is unbelievably telling, I don't think it really matters if this is her own psych space or a literal observation center. That being said, something about this teaser makes me feel like Moses is the one more interested in curing blood fiends than Dawn is, and she's just more interested in being free. Because just about every blood fiend we've talked about so far has mentioned struggling with freedom, and she is no exception. And that's about as much as I can say the original theory holds up here. Once we move away from Dawn's own situation into the events of Kanto 7 itself, a lot changes based on this teaser. For instance, the scissor woman, she's the barber. I may not be as sure about this as I am about Moses, but really don't see another great answer. And if you want to know her qualifications, well, first there's being a trickster and creating roles for others. Whoever made Cassetti's mask clearly wanted him to play royalty. She's also the reason that Dawn rushes into battle and subsequently loses control of Rocinante. And since this has never happened before, I imagine the only person that could mess with these shoes is the one that made them. Also, she has scissors? That feels like a solid clue. And for anyone thinking that it can't possibly be her because Cassetti said his mask was made by the barber himself, well, yeah, I thought so too. But it turns out that PM retconned that line, so it's unclear what the gender of the barber is. Sincere thank you to Mulberry for sharing that one with me. So that's all well and good, but now that we know who the barber is, what is the Hat Man doing here? He's clearly aligned with the barber in this cutscene and seems to own La Mancha Land without being overtly hostile to the sinners. And the most likely reason for that is he's the priest from the original Don Quixote novel. Back to the source material, the barber would often appear alongside the priest, who after hearing about Don Quixote terrorizing people for his own brand of distorted justice, attempted to make a trap in order to catch him and bring him home. The plan was that one of them would dress up like a damsel in distress to get his help solving some wrongdoing and lure him back to the village in turn. And, I mean, what does this look like? In short, while I don't think Limbus Company is going to be caught between a war of blood fiend hunters and a blood fiend parade, though man, that would have been fucking incredible, what we're more likely to see is the sinners lured to La Mancha Land, where the Hat Man dotes over Dawn to make her comfortable before he and the barber mess with Rocinante to bring her back to her senses. This could mean releasing her as a blood fiend, starting the parade, or hell, getting the Order of the Lunar Visaged in as an ambush, because don't you dare think for a second I didn't notice that the Order was on another expedition in Uptail's ID Uptie story. Where are they going, Project Moon? What's so important that they can't help X-Corp? And that's the bulk of what I got. Maybe we'll touch on that in videos as the Kanto releases. But the last thing worth mentioning is this theory right here. Yeah, this feels a lot more likely now. Considering that the original story talked about Don Quixote seeing Dulcinea as a woman with golden hair and eyes that are suns? Yeah, I know I said it before, but I can definitely see the vision. Personally, I'm not thrilled with the idea of PM going in that direction if it's the biggest reveal of Kanto 7, but if they can use Don being Dulcinea as a plot point to tell a more interesting story, rather than making it just a massive, surprising twist, then sure, it's not a matter of whether I think they're capable of that, it's whether or not it turns out that way. Besides, I don't know what other interpretation would explain how her eyes just do that. And that's it. Don Quixote was a bored old blood fiend that found a reason to go off on her own for the sake of adventure, eventually ran into Limbus Company and Moses, who took an interest in Rocinante, and is using that as a means to potentially cure the blood fiend distortion. Meanwhile, Kanto 7 is where Don will be trapped and forced to face all she's run away from, probably ruining Moses' plan while we're at it too. And this is everything we need to know about Don Quixote. Unless the trailer has anything to say about it, please tell me that whatever blurry screenshots of CGs and new pulls we get don't bring up any new revelations on the lore, please? Editing Frey, put up a wall of text if there's nothing noteworthy. No one's gonna read it, we can call it there. Wow, what a great reveal that trailer that released on October 5th was. And until the season launches, I've been Frey, and expect to stream every Thursday while the new Kanto releases. Like with every season, I'm making a gimmick run so that the game gets more interesting at the same rate the plot does. And this go around, I made a little MVP only run, where after every fight, every ID that wasn't the MVP is banned for the rest of the Kanto. And as always, thanks so much to my Patreon and YouTube member supporters. And if you want to get these videos early, there's a link to become one right in the comments. But for now, goons, I'm gonna sleep. Because time is short, and it truly seems that only in slumber can I escape the dream ending. Y'all take care.